The gavel had barely struck when the judge looked up and froze. His eyes locked on me, an older woman in a navy suit sitting quietly beside my attorney. For a long, stunned moment, the entire courtroom went silent. The attorneys shuffled their papers, the bailiff cleared his throat, but the judge still stared at me as if he had just seen a ghost. "It's her," he murmured under his breath, though everyone heard it. I felt my stomach twist. Around me, people craned their necks to see who he was talking about. My son's lawyer frowned, my daughter-in-law adjusted her pearl necklace with a smirk, and even my granddaughter looked confused. Nobody in that room understood why a sitting judge had suddenly lost his composure at the sight of me. But I knew. The truth is, I wasn't just the frail grandmother they thought they could strip of her home and dignity. I was someone with a past, and this trial this day was about to remind them all. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling the scent of polished wood and paper. It carried me back through decades. To mornings when I rose before dawn, when I carried laundry up narrow stairs, when I brewed coffee in the same chipped mug I had used for over 30 years. I thought about the violets on my windowsill, delicate purple blooms my late husband used to tend before cancer took him away. To the world, I was Margaret Collins, 68, a widow living alone in the same house where my son had taken his first steps. But to my family, at least recently, I was a burden. A reminder of the years they'd rather forget. I glanced at my son across the aisle. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold. His wife leaned into him, whispering, as if my very presence offended her. They had spent months convincing everyone I wasn't capable of managing my own affairs, that I needed protection. What they really wanted was control. The judge finally composed himself, sliding his glasses back on. "Proceed," he said, but his voice betrayed a tremor of recognition. And as the lawyers began their opening statements, I let my mind drift backward. To the rituals of my quiet life, to the sacrifices I had made for a child who now wanted me erased, to the betrayal that had brought me to this moment. Because before this courtroom, before the shocked silence, there had been dinners uneaten, doors slammed, whispered insults, and nights of humiliation in my own home. And before this judge remembered who I was, I had nearly forgotten myself. This is how it began. Before lawyers, paperwork, and threats of guardianship, I had a simple life built on routine. Every morning at 6, I rose from the same creaky mattress, brewed coffee in that chipped mug, and watered the violets on the windowsill. I liked how the steam from the coffee fogged up the glass just as sunlight crept into the kitchen. It made me feel grounded, even in grief. For 40 years, my husband and I raised our only child, Daniel, in that house. Every hallway echoed with his laughter. Every wall carried the marks of his growing-up pencil lines recording his height, taped report cards, crooked art projects. After his father passed, I thought Daniel and I would grow closer, bound by the loss of the man we both loved. Instead, a distance grew. I replayed the sacrifices I had made, the kind that no one applauds. I scrubbed floors in other people's offices at night, my knees aching from chemical cleaners. I stitched clothes for neighbors when my hands were stiff from arthritis. I sold cookies at church bazaars to cover Daniel's college textbooks. While his friends went on ski trips, he had new sneakers because I saved for weeks to buy them. I carried the weight of making sure he never felt poor, even when I was counting pennies at the grocery store. I used to believe that love was enough, that if you gave, it would come back. But somewhere between Daniel's first paycheck and his first mortgage, gratitude turned into expectation. His wife, Lillian, only sharpened that blade. From the first time she crossed my doorstep, with her manicured nails tapping against her phone and her polished voice dripping with polite disdain, I knew I would never be enough in her eyes. "Such a quaint place," she had said, scanning my kitchen as though it were a thrift store. Her own parents owned vacation homes, while I clung to the little house that had carried us through decades. Holidays became colder. Thanksgiving dinners where Daniel carved the turkey but avoided my eyes. Birthdays where my gifts were politely unwrapped then forgotten. Phone calls replaced with text messages that said, "Busy, we'll call later." Later rarely came. What hurt most wasn't their absence, but the slow erosion of respect. A sigh when I repeated myself. A look exchanged between them when I asked about their work. The implication that my world, cooking, gardening, volunteering at the library, was small and useless compared to theirs. I often sat at the dining table late at night, staring at framed photographs of a boy who once told me I was his hero. I'd ask myself, when did I stop being enough? When did my love turn invisible? The answer came the night they told me I didn't belong in my own home anymore. It was a Sunday evening when the knife twisted. I had spent the whole day preparing Daniel's favorite meal, chicken pot pie, with a buttery crust that took hours to get right. I set the table with my embroidered tablecloth, polished silverware, and a vase of tulips from the farmer's market. I wanted it to feel warm, like family should. When Daniel and Lillian walked in, I greeted them with a smile that didn't quite reach my tired eyes. My granddaughter, Emily, trailed behind, earphones in, barely glancing up. She was 13 now, restless, sharp-tongued, but with a softness I recognized in the way she lingered by the violets on the windowsill. Dinner started stiff. Lillian picked on her salad, offering small talk about a charity gala. Daniel nodded occasionally, checking his watch as though he had somewhere better to be. I tried to bridge the silence. "Emily, how's school?" She shrugged, muttering, "Fine." The clink of forks against porcelain filled the room like static. Halfway through, Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, we've been talking. This house is too much for you. It's old, drafty, and unsafe. You shouldn't be here alone." I blinked. "This is my home. I've lived here for 40 years. Lillian set down her fork, her voice smooth but cold. "Exactly. It's outdated. The plumbing's ancient. The wiring's a hazard. You could sell it, Mom, and move somewhere comfortable. We even found a retirement community with amenities. Pool, activities, medical staff on site. You'd be happier there. Happier." As if losing the walls that carried my memories could make me happy. I looked around. The dent in the table where Daniel had dropped his toy truck, the curtains I'd sewn myself, the shelf where my husband's watch still Saturday. Every detail whispered of a life built with love. Emily finally looked up, confused. "But Grandma loves this house." Her voice was tentative, unsure, but it cut through the air like a bell. Daniel avoided my eyes. "Sweetheart, this isn't up for debate." I felt something inside me fracture. My son, for whom I had sacrificed youth and health, was treating me like a burden to be managed. My daughter-in-law's eyes gleamed with anticipation, as if she already saw the for sale sign on my lawn. "I'm not leaving," I said firmly, though my voice trembled. Lillian's smile didn't falter. "We've already spoken to a realtor. The appraisal is next week." The casserole on the table grew cold. The tulips sagged, and I realized this wasn't a conversation. It was a decision, already made without me. The week that followed felt like an ambush in slow motion. On Tuesday morning, while I was watering the violets, a man in a gray suit appeared at my door with a clipboard. "Here for the appraisal," he said briskly, brushing past me before I could respond. He walked through the house as though I were invisible, scribbling notes about dated fixtures and deferred maintenance. When I protested, Daniel arrived minutes later, all charm for the stranger, dismissive for me. "Mom, just let him do his job." I stood in the living room, my hands trembling. "This is still my house," I whispered. "Not for long," the appraiser muttered, not even looking up. By Friday, a lawyer showed up with crisp papers and a rehearsed smile. "Mrs. Collins, we have documents prepared for the transfer of property. It's a formality. Your son and his wife will handle everything." He slid the papers across my dining table, right over the tablecloth I had stitched by hand years ago. I stared at the signature line, the black ink waiting like a trap. "Transfer? I thought you were selling." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, while Lillian answered smoothly. "It makes more sense to keep it in the family. For the grandchildren, you won't have to worry about taxes or upkeep. It's really for the best." Her tone was syrup, but her eyes gleamed like steel. My throat closed. "You mean, you want me out, but you want to keep the house?" Daniel finally looked at me, his jaw tight. "Mom, you've been forgetful lately. Last week you left the oven on." "That's not true," I shot back, heat rising in my chest. He sighed, exasperated. "Mom, it's dangerous. You can't live alone anymore." A lie, twisted into a weapon. The lawyer folded his hands. "If you don't sign voluntarily, there are legal avenues, a guardianship petition, Mental incapacity proceedings. It's cleaner if you agree. The words slammed into me harder than any physical blow. My son, my only child, was willing to strip me of not just my home, but my mind. That night, I sat in the quiet, staring at the walls my husband had painted decades ago. I touched the wooden banister, worn smooth by countless hands. Every surface held history. Every corner carried love. To them, it was just equity. To me, it was the last piece of myself. I pressed my palms to the table, whispering into the empty room, "They won't take this from me. Not without a fight." 2 nights later, sleep refused to come. I wandered the house in silence, every creak of the floorboards echoing like a warning. In the study, I opened my late husband's desk drawer, the one I hadn't touched since his funeral. Most of it was ordinary old bills, yellowed receipts, faded birthday cards, but at the very back, I found a slim leather folder with his initials pressed into the cover. A small lock sealed it. My pulse quickened. I searched the drawers, rifled through books, until inside an old dictionary I discovered a brass key taped to the back cover. My hands shook as I turned it in the lock. The folder opened with a soft click, and inside lay papers that would change everything. The first document was a savings bond certificate, worth more than I had ever imagined. Behind it, a stack of life insurance policies in my name, untouched. Deeds to a small lake house in upstate New York I never knew he'd purchased. Brokerage statements that made my head spin with numbers. At the bottom was a letter, written in my husband's familiar looping script. The paper smelled faintly of cedar, the scent of his old study. "My Maggie," it began. "If you are reading this, I am gone. I did not want you to spend your later years worrying about survival. I wanted you to have freedom, choices, dignity. That is why I built this nest in secret, piece by piece. I feared Daniel might grow careless, and I wanted to protect you from pressure or manipulation. These assets are solely yours, and yours to control." Tears blurred the ink as I read on. "You always carried our family. You sacrificed without complaint. If our son treats you with love, share with him. If he does not, stand firm. You will have the power to say no. Never forget you are not a burden. You are the heart of this family." I pressed the letter to my chest, sobs shaking through me. For months I had felt stripped bare, humiliated, small. But here was proof that I wasn't powerless. My husband had trusted me enough to plan for the battles I didn't even know were coming. When I lifted my eyes, the study looked different. The cracked lamp, the dusty shelves, even the worn rug, all of it glowed with new meaning. I wasn't just an aging widow clinging to memories. I was the keeper of a hidden legacy. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something stir inside me. Not just grief, not just fear resolve. I stayed up until dawn, reading every line of those documents, tracing the ink with trembling fingers. The brokerage statements spelled out numbers I had never dared to imagine. The savings bonds, untouched for decades, were now worth enough to buy not just security, but independence. My husband had planned this carefully, deliberately, almost like he knew one day I would need to defend myself against the very people I once trusted most. The letter lay open beside me, its words replaying in my head. "Never forget you are not a burden. You are the heart of this family." I whispered it aloud, letting the sound of his voice echo in my memory. For weeks, I had let their words eat at me, unsafe, forgetful, a burden. They had stripped away my confidence piece by piece until I was almost ready to surrender. But now, with my husband's handwriting before me, I remembered who I was. I wasn't the trembling woman at their mercy. I was the woman who had built a life from nothing, who had raised a child with grit and devotion, who had endured every storm without breaking. I walked through the house slowly, running my fingers along the banister, the walls, the photos still hanging in their frames. These weren't relics of the past, they were proof of a life well lived. My son saw square footage and resale value. I saw scraped knees healed at the kitchen table, prom photos by the staircase, birthday candles blown out in the dining room. The more I walked, the more the fear drained from me. In its place came something steadier, a calm fire. My husband had given me more than money. He had given me permission to fight. I made tea in my chipped mug, savoring the bitterness, and sat by the window as the sun rose. Outside, the world seemed almost new, the lights spilling gold across the lawn. I realized then that this battle wasn't just about property, it was about dignity. It was about teaching Daniel, and maybe even Lillian, that love is not measured in what you can take from someone, but in how you honor what they've given you. For the first time in months, I felt taller, stronger, almost unbreakable. I whispered into the quiet. They have no idea who they're dealing with. The confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It started in my own dining room during a family reunion I hadn't even wanted to host. My sister-in-law insisted it would be good for the family to gather after so much tension. Against my better judgment, I agreed, thinking maybe it could soften the edges. By early evening, the house buzzed with chatter. Plates clinked, laughter spilled from cousins who hadn't seen each other in years, and the smell of roast beef filled the air. But beneath it all, I felt a current of unease. Daniel and Lillian moved through the room like hosts in a home they didn't yet own, greeting relatives, giving little tours as though the house were already theirs. I caught snippets of conversation that made my stomach twist. "We'll probably renovate this kitchen first," Lillian told one of my nieces, gesturing toward my old oak cabinets. "Open concept, marble countertops," Daniel chimed in. "Plenty of space for the kids when we finally expand the family." They were talking about my home while I stood right there, holding a tray of glasses like I was the help. Finally, after dessert, Lillian cleared her throat and tapped her wine glass. "We'd like to share some exciting news," she announced. "Mom has agreed that it's time for her to transition into a safer, more comfortable community, so this house will stay in the family, with us." The room fell quiet. I felt every eye turn to me. My hands shook, but I steadied them against the table. "That is not what I agreed to," I said, my voice calm but cutting through the silence like a knife. Daniel tried to interrupt. "Mom, let's not make this difficult." I straightened my back and placed a folder on the table. "Difficult? What's difficult is pretending I'm powerless when I'm not. You want to talk about ownership? Let's talk about receipts." I opened the folder, spreading out property deeds, savings bonds, bank statements, and a copy of my husband's will. Gasps rippled through the relatives as they leaned closer. "This house is mine. The lake house upstate? Mine. The account you thought was empty? Very much not empty. And the will? It states clearly that I, and only I, decide how these assets are used." Daniel's face drained of color. Lillian's smile froze, brittle as glass. A cousin whispered, "She owns everything." I turned to the room, my voice steady. For months, I've been told I'm forgetful, incapable, ready to be tucked away. But here are the facts. I am not only capable, I am the legal owner of more than my son ever imagined, and I will not be treated like a burden in the home I built with my husband. The silence was electric. Some relatives exchanged shocked looks, others avoided Daniel's eyes. For the first time in a long while, I saw Lillian falter. Her perfect posture slumped, her lips pressing into a thin, angry line. "Now," I said, folding the papers back into the folder. "If anyone else has renovations to propose for my home, they can kindly keep them to themselves." The room erupted in uneasy murmurs. My granddaughter Emily's eyes widened with something I hadn't seen in years: pride. After the reunion, the house felt different. The walls that had witnessed so many years of quiet sacrifice now held the echoes of gasps, whispers, and the sharp crack of truth being laid bare. For a few days, the phone rang off the hook with relatives, some offering support, others politely probing for details about what I really owned. I let most calls go unanswered. Daniel, however, wasn't finished. He came storming into the house one evening, his face flushed, Lillian close behind with her smile sharpened like a blade. "What you did was humiliating," he spat. "Dragging our private family matters in front of everyone like that." "Our?" I repeated quietly, standing in the doorway between the kitchen and living room. "Those documents weren't yours to share. They're mine. My husband's legacy. My home." Lillian stepped forward, her heels clicking against the hardwood. "You don't understand, Margaret. This isn't just about you. We need stability. We need assets. For Emily. For the family's future." Emily had been lingering on the stairs, earbuds dangling around her neck. She came down slowly, her face pale. "Don't talk about me like I'm not here," she muttered. Sweetheart, Daniel said, softening his tone. We just want to make sure you're provided for. She's getting older. Things could happen. We can't risk her forgetting bills or letting the house fall apart. Emily's eyes flicked to me, then back to her father. She remembers more than you think, she said. Her voice cracked, but it carried. For a heartbeat, the room froze. My son's jaw tightened. Lillian's smile faltered. I stepped closer to Emily, resting a hand on her shoulder. Thank you, love. My voice shook, not from fear, but from the weight of her choosing me in that moment. But Daniel wasn't finished. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and slapped it onto the table. If you refuse to be reasonable, we'll take this to court. Guardianship, incapacity, whatever it takes. The words hung like smoke. My chest tightened, but I held my ground. Do what you think you must, I told him. But remember, you won't just be fighting me. You'll be fighting the truth. Emily looked between us, her young face caught in the crossfire of generations. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, Dad, why are you doing this? He didn't answer. He couldn't. That night, after they left, Emily stayed. She helped me wash the dishes in silence, then finally asked, Grandma, if they take you to court, can they win? I dried my hands on a towel, choosing my words carefully. Not if I keep fighting. Not if I use every piece of truth your grandfather left for me. And not if I remember who I am. Emily nodded slowly. In her eyes, I saw both fear and something else, loyalty. Maybe even courage. The battle wasn't over. It was only beginning. The letter from Daniel's lawyer arrived on a gray Monday morning. A thick envelope, heavy enough to feel like a threat before I even opened it. Inside, the words cut deeper than any knife. Petition for guardianship. They claimed I was mentally unfit to manage my own affairs, citing memory lapses, unsafe living conditions, and financial mismanagement. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd paid bills for 40 years, and let the papers tremble in my hands. My teacup clinked against the saucer, though not from weakness, anger vibrated through me. They thought they could erase me with ink on paper. I called Victoria, the attorney, recommended by a neighbor, a sharp-eyed woman who had once fought a nursing home corporation and won. When she read through the documents, her lips pressed into a thin line. This is serious, Margaret. But it's also sloppy. They overreached. Guardianship cases require proof, not paranoia. And you, my dear, have receipts. For weeks, preparation consumed my days. Victoria advised me to gather evidence. Utility bills paid on time, bank statements showing regular deposits, medical records proving I was in good health. I compiled it all in a binder, every page a rebuttal to the lies Daniel and Lillian had written. Neighbors volunteered testimonies. Mrs. Alvarez from across the street, who saw me tending the garden daily. The postman who'd chatted with me for years about politics and weather. Even the pharmacist confirmed I was sharp, handling medications with precision. But the most damning evidence came unexpectedly. Emily, bless her, had secretly recorded one of her parents' conversations. In it, Daniel said, if we push the dementia angle hard enough, the court will have to listen. Lillian's laugh followed, cold and hollow. When Emily handed me the file on a flash drive, her hands shook. I don't want to hurt Dad, but it isn't right. You don't deserve this. I hugged her, feeling her small frame pressed against mine. You just gave me the truth, sweetheart. And truth always matters. The hearing date arrived faster than I expected. Walking into the courthouse, I felt the weight of every sacrifice, every humiliation, every moment I'd been told I was less than. My son sat at the opposite table, his lawyer shuffling papers, Lillian whispering in his ear. Emily sat behind me, her hands clasped tightly, eyes wide with fear and defiance. Daniel's attorney painted me as a frail woman trapped in nostalgia, incapable of managing a modern life. He described the house as a hazard, my finances as inexplicably complex, my judgment clouded by grief. Then Victoria stood. Calm, deliberate, she laid out the evidence. The binder of receipts, testimonies from neighbors, my clean medical reports. She ended with the recording, played softly through the courtroom speakers. Daniel's voice filled the room, dripping with calculation. "If we push the dementia angle hard enough, the court will have to listen." Gasps echoed, the judge's brows furrowed. I sat straighter, heart pounding but steady. For the first time, it wasn't just my word against theirs. The lies had been caught in their own net, and still, I knew the hardest part, the climax of this storm, was yet to come. The courtroom hushed after the recording ended. Daniel's face flushed scarlet. Lillian's manicured hand gripped his arm so tightly her knuckles went white. Their lawyer stammered, fumbling for words, but the damage was done. The lie was laid bare for everyone to hear. The judge leaned back, studying me with an intensity that made me shift in my seat. He removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, then spoke. "Mrs. Collins. Margaret Collins?" His voice held a strange tremor. "Yes, Your Honor," I answered, confused by his tone. He stared at me for a long moment. "Did you once work in the family court office, nearly 40 years ago, as a clerk for Judge Miller?" My breath caught. Memories rushed back, long days in that musty office, organizing case files, typing transcripts, running coffee for exhausted interns. I remembered a nervous young man, unsure of himself, constantly tripping over paperwork but eager to learn. I had encouraged him when others mocked. "Yes," I said softly. "I remember." The judge's stern expression cracked into something warmer, almost reverent. "You helped me. You trained me when no one else had patience. You told me I'd make a fine lawyer one day, when I didn't even believe it myself." He paused, voice thickening. "I never forgot your kindness, Mrs. Collins." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, whispering to his lawyer. Lillian's eyes darted between the judge and me, panic slowly overtaking her practiced smile. The judge cleared his throat, regaining composure. "There is no question here. The petition for guardianship is denied. Furthermore, I find the claims made by Mr. Collins and Mrs. Collins to be knowingly false and malicious." His gavel struck once, sharp and final. "The court rules in favor of Mrs. Margaret Collins. Full autonomy, full rights to her property and finances remain solely hers." Gasps filled the room. Daniel buried his face in his hands. Lillian stiffened like stone. Emily clutched my hand so tightly I thought my bones might crack, whispering, "You did it, Grandma." But it wasn't just me. It was decades of sacrifice, a husband's foresight, and a simple truth. Dignity cannot be stolen when you refuse to surrender it. As we left the courtroom, the same judge who had once been a boy fumbling with files called after me. "Mrs. Collins, thank you. Justice remembers." The victory was mine, but more than that, it was public. They had tried to erase me, and instead, they exposed themselves. News travels fast in families, and humiliation travels faster. Within days, word of the courtroom defeat spread through cousins, uncles, and neighbors who had always whispered about Daniel's ambition. Calls poured in not to me, but to him. I overheard one relative on speakerphone during a tense visit. "Danny, how could you try to put your own mother in a home for money?" The shame clung to him like a stain. Lillian, ever polished, tried to spin it. "We were only worried for her safety," she insisted at Sunday service. But the congregation's side glances told another story. I noticed how quickly people turned away when she tried to chat in the parking lot. Her mask of control was cracking. At home, I found unexpected company. Emily began showing up more often, sometimes with her backpack slung over her shoulder, sometimes just with a notebook and earbuds. She'd sit at the kitchen table while I cooked, sketching or scrolling through her phone, but her presence warmed the house. One evening, after the dishes were stacked and the violets watered, she asked quietly, "Grandma, can I stay here for a while? Dad and Mom fight all the time now. I feel like I can breathe here." I studied her face, the shadows under her eyes, the way her voice carried both defiance and longing. "Of course you can," I said. My chest tightened with both joy and sorrow. She deserved better than the battlefield her parents had made. Daniel's visits grew sporadic. Sometimes he stormed in, red-faced, accusing me of turning Emily against him. Other times, he arrived silent, hollow-eyed, sitting at the table without touching his coffee. Lillian rarely came with him anymore. One night, he lingered in the doorway as Emily set the table. "Mom," he said softly, I never meant for it to go this far." His voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy. "I just thought, if I didn't fight for something, I'd end up with nothing." I looked at him, really looked at him, the man he had become, the boy he had once been, and the choices that had carried him here. My heart ached. I wanted to reach out, to fold him into forgiveness, but scars don't vanish overnight. "Daniel," I said gently, "you didn't fight for something. You fought against me, and there's a difference." He lowered his eyes, shame pulling his shoulders down. Emily watched silently, her young face caught between pity for her father and loyalty to me. That night, after he left, she whispered, "Do you think he'll change?" I sighed, brushing her hair from her forehead. "That's up to him. But you already see the truth. That's what matters." The house was no longer empty. It was becoming a place of healing, even as the fractures of betrayal still ran deep. With Emily staying more often, the house felt alive again. The sound of her laughter drifting from the living room as she FaceTimed friends, the clatter of cereal bowls left in the sink, even the hum of her music bleeding through her bedroom door. It all reminded me of a time long ago when Daniel was young and the house had been filled with noise and possibility. But I knew life couldn't just return to what it was. Something inside me had shifted after the trial. I couldn't let the pain or the victory end at my doorstep. I began sorting through the folders my husband had left behind, not just the deeds and bank statements, but the personal notes he'd tucked between them. In one, he had scribbled, "If you ever feel alone, use this to build something that matters." Those words planted a seed. With Victoria's help, I established a foundation, the Collins Trust for Dignity, dedicated to supporting older women who faced financial exploitation, abandonment, or the kind of manipulation I had endured. At first, it was just me, a mission statement typed on an old laptop and a modest donation from one of the savings bonds. But within months, it grew. We started hosting workshops at the community center, teaching women how to protect their assets, how to read contracts, how to recognize red flags in their own families. The local paper ran a story, "Widow turns betrayal into lifeline for others." Soon, donations began trickling in, then flooding. I watched in awe as women I'd never met shared their stories. One woman had been pressured to sign over her house to a nephew. Another had lost her pension to a son-in-law's business venture. They sat at folding tables in that drafty center, tears in their eyes, nodding as I told them, "You are not invisible. You are not disposable. You have power, and you deserve to keep it." Emily often joined me at these meetings. At first, she came reluctantly, scrolling through her phone. But little by little, she started listening. I caught her whispering once to a woman who had come in shaking with fear, "My grandma fought back. You can too." One evening, after a workshop, Emily slipped her hand into mine as we walked to the car. "Grandma," she said softly, "I want to help more. Maybe design the flyers or manage the website. We could make it look cooler so more people my age pay attention." Tears pricked my eyes. "You'd do that for me?" "For us," she corrected. And just like that, our legacy was no longer about survival. It was about building something bigger, together. By the time autumn leaves turned gold and red, the Collins Trust had grown into something the whole town whispered about. What started in a church basement now had an office with volunteers, attorneys, and even a retired banker offering pro bono advice. For the first time in decades, my name carried respect in the community, not as someone's wife, not as someone's burden, but as Margaret Collins, founder. So, when the holidays rolled around, I decided to do something bold. I hosted a family gathering, not the kind where Daniel and Lillian dictated the seating chart, but one in which I set the terms. I sent invitations to cousins, siblings, and even a few neighbors who had stood by me during the worst. The night of the dinner, the house glowed with lights strung along the porch. Inside, the dining table was dressed in my best linen, polished silver, and Emily's handmade centerpiece of pine cones and candles. As guests arrived, laughter and warmth filled the air. There was no undercurrent of dismissal this time, no whispered calculations about property values. Halfway through the meal, I tapped my glass. "Thank you all for coming. This house has seen more than its share of silence and sorrow, but tonight I want it to ring with something else: gratitude. I paused, letting my eyes sweep in the room. I may be older, but I've learned something powerful. Dignity doesn't retire, and respect isn't optional. Some relatives exchanged nods, others lowered their eyes. Then Emily spoke up, her young voice carrying across the table. Grandma taught me that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary, and I'm proud of her. A hush fell, followed by applause. My chest swelled, not with pride alone, but with relief. Emily wasn't just my granddaughter, she was proof that the cycle could break. Not everyone clapped. Daniel had come, reluctantly, sitting at the far end. His shoulders slumped, his plate barely touched. When the applause ended, he cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, voice raw, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway." The room tensed. Even Lillian, absent this time, couldn't shield him from the weight of his words. I met his eyes, my heart caught between years of betrayal and the flicker of the boy he once was. "Daniel," I said slowly, "forgiveness isn't a gift handed out at the table like dessert. It's something you earn, and it takes time." He nodded, tears shining in his eyes. Emily slipped her hand into mine under the table. The evening continued, lighter now, though the undercurrent of unfinished business remained. But for the first time, I felt no need to hide, no need to shrink. My story had been spoken, my truth revealed. The fractures were visible, yes, but so was the light shining through them. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges. 5 years passed, and the house that once echoed with conflict now thrummed with new life. Emily was no longer a restless teenager, but a young woman in college, studying social work. She still came home often, her laptop and books spread across the kitchen table, coffee brewing in the same chipped mug that had seen my darkest and brightest days. The Collins Trust had blossomed far beyond my imagination. What started as a handful of women gathered in a community center was now a network spanning 3 states. We had counselors, attorneys, and partnerships with local banks. More than 200 women had reclaimed homes, pensions, or simple peace of mind because they'd found us. On a quiet afternoon, I walked through the new office, a converted brick building downtown, where volunteers sorted files and answered calls. A mural covered one wall, women of all ages, painted in strong colors, standing shoulder to shoulder. Emily had helped design it, sneaking in her signature at the corner, EC, for Grandma. As for Daniel, life had carved lessons deeper than my words ever could. After Lillian left him, his career faltered. He tried calling me, sometimes at odd hours, his voice thick with regret. Some conversations ended with apologies, others with silence. I never turned him away, but I never pretended the past hadn't happened. Trust, like a shattered vase, can be pieced together, but the cracks always remain. The house upstate became a sanctuary. Summers, Emily and I would sit on the porch overlooking the lake, sipping iced tea, talking about everything from school stress to the foundation's future. Sometimes Daniel would visit, helping fix a loose shutter or mow the lawn. He spoke less, listened more, his arrogance tempered into something humbler. One evening, as fireflies blinked across the yard, Emily leaned her head against my shoulder. "Grandma," she said softly, "you changed everything. Not just for me, for all those women. Do you ever wish things had been easier?" I smiled, brushing her hair back. Because if life had been easy, I might never have found my strength, and you might never have seen what it looks like to fight back." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the fading sunset. The years had not erased the pain, but they had transformed it. What once threatened to break me had become the very foundation of something lasting. And every time I saw a woman walk into our office with fear in her eyes and leave with her head held higher, I knew my husband's letter had been right. I was never a burden. I was the heart of this family, and now the heartbeat of something even larger. The morning light filtered through lace curtains as I stood by the window, watering the violets my husband once loved. Their blossoms were stubborn, blooming year after year despite storms, neglect, and change. I saw myself in those flowers, resilient, steady, still standing. Emily bustled in, her laptop under one arm, coffee in the other. She was older now, with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew who she was becoming. "Grandma," she said with a grin, "the board approved the new outreach program. We'll be able to help women in 3 more counties." I set down the watering can, smiling. "Your grandfather would be proud." Her eyes softened. So would Dad. Daniel had begun visiting more regularly, though cautiously. The road back to trust was long, but I had stopped measuring it in miles. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes just silence. He never asked for money, never tried to reclaim power. And though forgiveness hadn't erased the cracks, it had allowed us to sit at the same table without bitterness swallowing the air. That Christmas, Emily gathered everyone, me, Daniel, even a few cousins for dinner at the lake house. No whispered schemes, no barbed comments. Just laughter, stories, and the smell of roast turkey filling the air. When Daniel raised a glass, his voice trembled. "To Mom, for teaching us what strength really looks like." I blinked back tears, not because I needed his validation, but because I had already found it in myself years ago. Later that night, as I rocked gently on the porch with Emily beside me, she asked, "Grandma, what's the most important thing you've learned through all of this?" I thought of the courtroom, of the betrayal at my own dinner table, of the letter tucked in a drawer that had saved me. I thought of every woman who had walked through our foundation's doors with shoulders bent and left with their chin lifted high. "The most important lesson," I said slowly, "is that real power doesn't come from money or revenge. It comes from refusing to let pain harden your heart. It comes from turning wounds into wisdom. And it comes from teaching the next generation to stand taller than you ever could." Emily rested her head on my shoulder, the stars glittering above us. "Then you've done it, Grandma. You've changed the story." And she was right. I had rewritten not only my ending, but the beginning of hers. I sipped my tea from the chipped mug, the violets blooming in the corner, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, peace wasn't a memory. It was the life I was living.